In March 2023, Jolanta Bennell was going about her day, about to hop on a subway in Brooklyn, New York.
So I walked into the station and I noticed a woman standing there sort of staring at the ground. And when I got a little closer, I saw that what she was staring at was a guy who was lying face down on the platform.
Jolanta and this woman could tell something was wrong. The man looked sick, unresponsive, and needed help. They decided to call 911. Then Jolanta had a thought. This man could be having an overdose. And then she remembered she had something that could help. Narcan nasal spray. It's the brand name for this medication, naloxone. It can reverse an opioid overdose fast.
So I thought, well, okay. And I got the Narcan out and I rolled him over and I gave him the Narcan. And about 10 seconds later, so he started waking up.
The Narcan appeared to work. Soon, police arrived, and the other bystander stayed with the man. And Jolanta hopped on her train.
And then when the train came, I got on the train because there didn't seem to be anything else for me to do. The EMS was on their way. The cops were there.
I think Jolanta's experience is really striking because here's somebody with pretty minimal training who has the power to save a life, essentially.
That's Alana Gordon. She's a producer for Post Reports. And she was recently digging into national health data about drug overdoses in the U.S. While there are signs of decline, the number of people dying nationwide from overdoses has eclipsed 100,000 annually between 2020 and 2023. But overdoses don't have to be fatal. The opioid crisis has prompted a big response across the country. And in 2023, naloxone became available as an over-the-counter drug. That means anybody can get it without a prescription. Some communities even distribute it for free. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Monday, February 24th. Today, I talk with Alana about how to use naloxone and how anyone who has it can save a life. Okay, so let's just dive in. Alana, what exactly is Narcan?
Yeah, so Narcan is an overdose reversing medication. It's a brand of naloxone. So
naloxone is the drug?
Yeah, naloxone is the medication that reverses overdoses. And then Narcan is one of the brands. There's other brands, too, that have been approved for over-the-counter, but this is the one that most of us recognize. And, some people I've heard it used as verbs, like someone got Narcaned. And a lot of people just have wound up using Narcan and naloxone interchangeably. But for this interview, I have a box of Narcan to show you.
So you're showing me like this box. It's like maybe the size of my palm and it's not heavy. It just sounds like, and it looks like there's like a little, I can open, I'm going to open it up.
We're not going to open up the actual.
Oh, the drug. Okay. So I'm opening up and there's 2 cartridges and it looks like a little nasal spray. And in fact, it does say it's a nasal spray.
Yeah. So what this is a medication, and inside is naloxone, and it's basically an overdose reversing medication specifically for opioids. In 2023, these types of nasal sprays, there's a couple different kinds, were made available over the counter without a prescription. So someone can walk into a pharmacy and just ask for it. In many communities, like in D.C., there's designated pharmacies where you can walk in and actually get it for free.
So is it widely distributed? Is it like government programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So especially during the pandemic, we saw an even bigger spike in overdoses. And around that time, the Biden administration expanded its overdose strategy and drug control strategy nationwide. And so a lot more resources went into programs, public health groups, harm reduction groups, and local cities and communities to make this a bit more widely available to people.
That's interesting.
Naloxone, it's amazing to see naloxone available so widely. But this came on the backs and shoulders of hard work of activists for years. Naloxone's not a new drug. It's been used since the 80s in hospitals and by paramedics. And then starting in the 90s and really picking up in the late 2000s, a group of activists and people who were seeing their friends dying of overdoses got together with a doctor. They would distribute naloxone around the country to groups, to harm reduction groups, to try and address this. And so what we're seeing is a lot of this work to get to this point where it is so widely available, built on years of efforts pushing to have this drug be in the hands of people who can have the ability to save someone's life.
Alana, when I think about who should be carrying naloxone, it leads me to wonder who's most at risk for an overdose? Like, who needs this medication the most?
So people who use illicit drugs of any kind are most at risk, opioids in particular, but it's a wide variety as well. If someone's concerned about someone around them, a loved one, friend, family, using drugs like opioids, that's also a good person to have it. And then in general, like, people are at higher risk of overdosing if they've overdosed before. If they've stopped using opioids and then use again, you can lose your tolerance thinking that you can use a higher level than your body's actually equipped for. So that's when you think about someone who's left jail or prison or treatment even. Another big risk factor for overdoses, an important thing to think about right now, is street drugs in general. I mean, they vary from region to region depending where you are. But what's increasingly happening is that drugs that aren't opioids, that people are taking like cocaine, might actually have a powerful opioid called fentanyl in it without people realizing. Fentanyl is this synthetic opioid that's so much more potent than heroin. It's been replacing heroin increasingly in the drug supply. It's been driving a lot of the overdose deaths we've been seeing in recent years. And it's really something that's increased the risks in general of overdoses.
I see. So really anyone using illicit drugs could be at risk of an overdose. Therefore, having this counteracting drug to reverse an overdose would be essential. But what about someone like Jolanta? Is she just someone who walks around and thinks, I should just have this in my bag?
So in Jolanta's situation, a few years back, she was at a holiday party at a friend's, and that friend had a daughter who had died of an overdose years earlier. Mm-hmm. So during this party, this friend actually was like, hey, everyone. And her husband was like, I want to show you all how to respond to an overdose. I want to tell you about naloxone because this could save someone's life. Wow. This could save someone like my daughter's life. I wish I had this at the time.
Oh, gosh, it was just kind of obvious, I guess. As soon as there was such a thing as a kit to carry around, and I've always got a backpack, and it just seemed like, well, how could this not be something that I would do if I can do it?
Do we know how widely it's being used, how widely it's being distributed?
I mean, during the pandemic, we saw a surge in overdose deaths during a time when we were already had already years earlier declared a national public health emergency. Mm-hmm. And so we've seen big efforts to get naloxone out to more people, and in particular, people who are using drugs around people who are at high risk, because those are the people who are going to most likely be in the right place at the right time to save a life. Mm-hmm. And even in the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in those responses by regular people being first to the scene and responding and using naloxone before emergency responders arrive.
Yeah, like before a paramedic. That's wild.
Yeah.
Alana, hearing about how widely distributed this medication is and how potent it can be to reverse the effects of an overdose, it does make me wonder if there's any criticism of distributing it so widely, because it sort of reminds me of the pros and cons or the criticism of free needle exchange programs in various cities across the country over the years, the idea being, let's distribute needles that are clean to drug users so that we can counteract potentially, the spread of HIV/AIDS, because this is like one of the main ways it's being spread in this community, for instance. But the criticism of that being, well, you're just encouraging or enabling, rather, drug use. And I'm wondering in this case, with this medication, is there a criticism, and what do public health experts have to say about why they think it's important to distribute this medication?
I can understand that is a pretty common question that people have. Public health experts really stress that interventions like syringe exchanges don't encourage drug use. In fact, they may even help people get services to take better care of themselves. The evidence just doesn't point to something like that increasing drug use, but rather improving health. the research and evidence around whether naloxone increases, for example, overdoses or risky drug use, public health researchers and the studies that I've looked at have not found that. And in fact, the people I've talked to stressed who've both researched this but also have experienced overdoses or responded have all discussed how this is a really difficult situation. Overdosing, being revived, can be a very, very uncomfortable experience. It means that you may have been at risk of dying. It can be extremely uncomfortable if you are dependent on opioids. You immediately go into withdrawal. And so many of the people I've talked to want to avoid being Narcaned. It's not something people want.
After the break, Alana walks me through how to use naloxone and what it's like for someone to experience an overdose reversal. We'll be right back.
I'm Robin Gavon, and I'm the senior critic at large for The Washington Post. I write about politics and race and the arts. You know, there's so much information and misinformation coming at people. And for me, a critic's job is to really cut through that and attempt to direct people towards what is of value. Subscribers are definitely the most engaged, and they're the ones that I feel like I'm most often having a conversation with. People who are really engaged in our culture and engaged in civic life in a way that can be really transformative. When you subscribe to The Washington Post, you support this kind of journalism. Learn more at subscribe.washingtonpost.com. I'm Robin Gavon, and I'm one of the people behind the Post.
Alana, I want to know when to use naloxone. So first, let's just start with how to tell if someone is actually overdosing or not. So just medically speaking, what is an overdose?
Yeah, medically speaking, what happens with an overdose is opioids hit these receptors in your brain, these special receptors. It might make you feel really good. It also slows down the mechanisms in your body that remind yourself to breathe.
So, okay, that's what's happening inside of someone's body. But how can I, just a person walking down the street, going on the subway, how can I tell whether the person I'm passing by who's maybe slouched over on the ground is sleeping or having an overdose?
Sure. I want to also just point out that those situations, like the story that Jolanta experienced, is so powerful and incredible, but also not the norm. The more common situation is someone who's using drugs is with somebody, or
the
someone
person.
Or again, it can be anybody. But either way, giving someone naloxone who isn't overdosing won't harm them.
Okay.
And so the idea of what do I have to lose by doing that? Now, if somebody is overdosing, there's some clues that you can look for.
Okay.
So
yeah, what are some of those clues?
Yeah. So the main clue is someone's not responsive and they're not breathing. One quick check is do you see their chest lifting? Do they look like they're breathing? Mm-hmm. Somebody's body might become limp. Their pupils might be smaller. If you're looking at them, their lips, their fingers, their face might start turning blue if they're lighter skin, mm-hmm. or gray or ashen if they're darker skinned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Alana, now let's say you've done the checks that you do and you now think the person you're seeing has overdosed. What's your next step? What do you do?
I actually talked to a lot of people about this who've experienced overdoses, who've responded, and it's really eye-opening to learn about what these experiences actually are like and what sort of tips and insight we can all gain from that to be better equipped to respond. One of the people I spoke to was a woman named Sarah Laurel. She's 38, and she runs Savage Sisters Recovery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It operates a lot of sober living homes, and she runs a ton of naloxone trainings for all kinds of groups. And Sarah brings actually her own personal experience to this work. She used to be in a corporate job in marketing. She struggled with opioid addiction for a few years. She lost her job. At one point, she was unhoused.
Yeah, I've been reversed several times when I was in my active use. And I've reversed, I can't even count, hundreds.
And so she has a lot of really interesting tips around some of the straightforward ways to recognize and respond to an overdose. So the first quick thing is like, okay, you think someone might be overdosing, check on them.
The first things you always want to do is you want to try a verbal and a physical cue. So that just means going, yo, buddy, clap your hands. You know, are you good? Can I help you? And see if they respond. Typically, if somebody is not experiencing an overdose, they will respond and tell you to get off them, and you would get off them. And that's what we want. We want them to respond.
The next step is to do some kind of quick physical prompt. One option is this thing called a sternum rub. It's basically where you press your knuckles into a person's sternum, that part in their chest, with enough force, kind of back and forth for a few seconds. It can stir them. It's uncomfortable. It's a pressure point. Sarah actually prefers something else. It's called a nail bed press, where basically you press your thumbnail down on the part of a person's thumb or finger where that nail meets the bottom where their cuticle is. That can also cause enough discomfort to elicit a response from somebody. It's also a little bit less invasive, especially for someone who's a female. And if there's still no response, no breathing, nothing, then it's like, call 911, call emergency responders, and get out that naloxone to administer it.
So how do you then administer naloxone?
Yeah. So in the case of Jolanta, she encountered that man who was face down on the ground. You obviously need to move them over.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm.
So you roll them over gently towards you. And then you're going to take this naloxone. You can see this spray here.
I see this little spray. It's in a little plastic container.
You're going to open it and you're going to put that up that person's nose and you're going to spray it.
And is it just one nostril?
Time, one nostril.
And that's all you need to do?
Yeah, that's what you need to do. Sarah also just says to be prepared that this process can be a little gross, and that's normal.
Also, a lot of times when somebody is overdosing, they will have foam or spit or snot or blood coming out of both of their mouth and nose. So when you administer that nasal Narcan, you want to shove it up their nostril and not just like the outer layer. And I hate to say it like this, but it's kind of yucky looking, but you want that spray to get up there.
So what happens next?
So after that, this is like a critical part where the waiting can be really intense, but essentially naloxone gets to work super fast. What it does is, how I was saying in an overdose, opioids get into those receptors and they are like, oh yeah, I'm high, but also forget to breathe. Mm-hmm. This medication gets to those same receptors and essentially kicks off the opioids and blocks it.
Wow. It's like a fight in your brain.
So that's going to reverse. Yeah. It can happen super fast. What winds up happening in a lot of instances, if someone's overdosing on an opioid, is that in many cases, within 1 to 3 minutes, a person may come to. They may be just slowly coming back to breathing slowly, kind of out of it. It's often very disorienting for a person. They may not recall, they may not know what's going on. Sarah Laurel talks about this a lot with me and others in her trainings. She actually remembers her own experience of being reversed. And just one thing that I learned that it really stands out to me is also the way that she has been revived and how people respond to her. That kind of bedside manner can make a big difference.
When I was reversed, having 4 men standing around me and coming out of unconsciousness, that's terrifying. I don't know what's happened. I don't know if I'm safe. I don't know that you just Narcaned me. So we really try to be mindful of that and not make a person feel terrified.
In that moment, a person might not realize they've overdosed. They might not remember anything. They might feel super ashamed. I know I mentioned that naloxone won't harm somebody. But if somebody is opioid dependent, it's going to be extremely uncomfortable. If somebody has used opioids a lot, it means that what it immediately does is put somebody into withdrawal. So that a person might immediately start shaking, feel nauseous, vomiting, feel super sick. Sarah Laurel has talked about how increasingly, let's say because there's a mix of drugs in the drug supply or the opioids are so powerful, a person may not come to right away. And in that instance, after about 3 minutes, if you're not seeing a response, it's often recommended to give another dose of naloxone if you have another spray. The packets come with 2 in a box. And the other thing that she really stresses is that as somebody's losing oxygen, the thing that can help them and even save them is rescue breaths or mouth to mouth. If you feel comfortable, if you've been trained, is a super powerful tool, and you don't need a medication for that.
Alana, the other thing I'm struck by hearing you talk about this is how powerful just doing this simple act can be and what that must feel like for the person administering naloxone. And like, how do they handle that situation?
It's a really intense situation.
Every time it happens, I'm in go mode. I very instinctively move through it. But as soon as that person comes back, I need to walk away. I need to take a couple minutes and just breathe and realize that, like, they're okay and I'm okay. And just kind of process what just happened.
You just encountered somebody maybe you know and love, face blue or, ashen gray, who may have essentially been dying, and you just brought them back.
Yeah. Alana, did you talk with other people who have been on the other side of this experience, the people who did overdose and were revived with naloxone?
Yeah, I mean, some of those details that I was describing about like the confusion or that kind of immediate withdrawal really stood out to me from someone I met here in Washington, D.C. named John Alston. Well, I'm wondering first if you could both introduce yourselves, if that's all right.
John Alston, outreach specialist for HIPS, and I love what I do.
So John is 52 now. He works for a local harm reduction agency called HIPS here in Washington, D.C., and he often goes out with his buddy Ronald Armstrong. They've both used drugs in the past, and they've experienced overdosing.
Again, like I said, I've OD'd several times, and at the time when I started shooting dope, it was the whole drug scene was different.
They go out into the community when there's been reports of a lot of overdoses. They check on people. They distribute naloxone and other supplies. Like there's now ways at strips where you can test to see if illicit drugs have fentanyl in it, which can indicate to somebody that maybe what they're taking might have a different kind of potency, as well as connecting people with services. So John told me, like, when I asked him about, his own experiences overdosing, I mean, he immediately thought to this one moment in particular. It wasn't the last time that he stopped using drugs, but it was a big moment for him. It really stood out. It was more than 15 years ago, and he was at his parents' home midday, and he went into the bathroom to inject a mix of heroin and cocaine.
And next thing you know, when I woke up, I was in the bathtub, and all these paramedics was around me. And I said, what happened? So I knew my dope was on the counter. So when they lift me up, I tried to grab it.
So I asked him in that moment what it felt like to overdose and then be reversed.
It's like when you go out, you don't remember nothing. All you remember is like waking up. And the first thing you see is unknown people around you. Either the paramedics or maybe it might be a friend of yours that you use with or something.
For John, he was dependent on opioids. And what he told me was that getting naloxone, it immediately put him into an opioid withdrawal. And that's why he said his first reaction was, in this disoriented moment, feeling terrible, was to try and find the drugs that were on the table to use again. For John, the other thing that really stands out in his memory, though, is not just that moment of literally overdosing and being brought back, but there was something else even bigger. It was the reaction from his parents that's really seared into his brain.
It was just the look on their face that of like, it wasn't a look of disgust. It was just a look of, why, how? When your uncles, you got friends, all these people that what they went through, that we went through together with them coming up. And how can you turn out like that?
And, for John, part of his story is over time, through his father's support, bringing him a meal. He was really hungry after, driving him to find services. And that, for him, was part of his trajectory to getting the kinds of medications that put him on a path to now being in the situation where he's, responding and supporting others. Mm. The thing that also really strikes both John and Ronald about these situations looking back is that years ago, naloxone, this overdose antidote, as many call it, it just wasn't widely available. What do you think of naloxone? How would you just describe it as a tool?
Yeah, I would say that it's remarkable. I am so happy for Narcan.
Naloxone.
Yeah, naloxone. They got it in stores. You can walk into CVS and get it. We deliver it. You can go different places and get it. It's so readily available that I am so happy, but yet it's still people ODing out here, and that really disturbs me.
Because we both have lost a lot of friends to overdose, and Narcan wasn't around.
You know, Alana, it's just hearing you describe this, it feels like so often in this world, people feel powerless, right? There's so much harm going on out there. And it's like, what can I as one individual do to reverse course for someone or actually do something that can make a huge difference? And here you're telling me about how people are out in communities right now, literally saving people's lives. And I'm just wondering, as you step back and think about all the people you spoke to, everything you saw, everything you learned, how did this leave you thinking about overdoses differently and addiction differently?
I think that there's like a mixed takeaway. One of the biggest risks for people overdosing that we haven't mentioned is when using alone. So there are so many situations where someone may have naloxone or may have the power to save somebody's life, but they don't know because the person's used alone. And then at the same time, it's really striking that more and more people have access to this medication now and are using it. And we're starting to even see in the last year or so, these numbers of overdoses are starting to go down. It's hard to say just yet what and why, and there's a lot of factors. But what we do know is many people are using this medication. And as much as there can be a lot of caveats and things to keep in mind if someone's overdosing and going through these steps, at the end of the day, what really strikes me about Jolanta's story is it's so easy.
You know what? It was a lot of good to do for a very low effort. Honestly, it was people have been giving me, praise for it and whatever. And I just I didn't jump into a frozen lake to save a drowning baby. It was just, it was easy.
Well, Alana, thank you so much for joining and sharing all of this reporting. It's really fascinating.
Thanks.
Alana Gordon is a producer for Post Reports. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was produced by Ariel Plotnick and mixed by Sam Baer. It was edited by Lucy Perkins with help from Maggie Penman and Allison McAdam. Thanks also to Anjuman Ali. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.